Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. The college basketball season officially complete with UConn winning the national championship last night for the second straight season. To help us talk about a little bit about that game, and we're going to bounce around to some transfer portal topics, probably talk a little Dusty May in Michigan. Dylan Burkhardt of UMHoops back on Podcast on the Brink. And Dylan, I've missed the moving screen pod so much this season that I had to have you on this week because we don't hear your takes very often anymore in the podcast format, other than what obviously what you do on UMHoops, but definitely miss what you and Brendan had going there with the moving screen this season.
I miss the pod too. I don't miss. I'm not too broken up about not having to do it through this entire season, which wouldn't have been the most fun season to podcast about from a Michigan point of view, but do miss the pod, and it's always good being on Podcast on the Brink. Excited to talk a little basketball. It's the new college basketball off season here. We're heating up.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that before we started the show. Like a couple, 4 or 5 years ago, we would have the off season was completely different in that you pretty much had an idea of, for the most part, other than some NBA draft departures and things like that, of what your roster was going to look like. And I know there's a ton of uncertainty with Indiana's roster right now with 6 open spots. Michigan's even in a much, I wouldn't call it a dire situation, but just a different situation in that not only with a new head coach coming in, you've got all these roster spots to fill. It's just crazy to think about how the transfer portal has changed college basketball and how, obviously the fans are still really engaged with the portal now. It kind of felt like before, like the season would end and people would kind of take a break and maybe go watch the NBA, go watch baseball, and now it's like everyone's dialed in on the portal.
Yeah, it is crazy, and I think there's this tendency to want to make it like, is the portal good or bad, or should you build with the portal or without the portal? But if you look at the teams in the Final Four of the national championship, like key portal additions across the board, like you have to be able to leverage the portal, even if you do different things, and your ability to recruit the right guys out of the portal to find the right fits. Like that's just become a part of the game. And I don't think we're really going to get away from it at this point, even if we can maybe make the process a little bit better. I think the 2-time transfer kind of rule going away has just led to complete chaos, at least from the first few weeks of the portal. And I think that's maybe the one thing that you'd look to fix. But I also think there are a lot of great opportunities. And I think it's pretty cool that you have guys who were playing at mid-majors. Basically, their careers would have kind of tapered out if in a normal situation, and they're now playing in the Final Four on the biggest stage. Like, I think that part of the story is fun, right? Like a Cam Spencer, a Tristan Newton, Lance Jones, like those guys are getting opportunities to play at a level of college basketball that 10 years ago, people who start their career at like Southern Illinois are never going to get, right? So that part is cool, and I do like that part, but it has changed the sport, especially with the COVID year.
I was totally in favor of the portal in terms of allowing guys to transfer without sitting out. But you just mentioned kind of the unlimited transfer thing, and I even saw some reporting, I think it was yesterday, from Nicole Auerbach over at The Athletic about, with the recent court case and kind of allowing now the unlimited transfers. And it seems like that's going to become the rule now, to where as long as you're in good academic standing, you're going to be able to transfer as much as you want. As much as I'm in favor of, and I've always made jokes on social media about like, coaches can leave whenever they want, but this kind of feels like maybe a little too much. Would you agree with that? I mean, it seems like it's going to be very difficult to build any continuity within a program. Obviously, there's going to be some exceptions with what we've seen with Purdue. They've done a pretty good job retaining players, but I just feel like, and I don't know what can be done from a legal standpoint or how this changes, but it kind of feels like an unsustainable thing if you're going to have players just changing teams every year.
Yeah, I think it's a big risk. And I think as a kind of a college basketball purist, I really worry about mid-majors and low majors and what becomes of that, because I do think over time, like the solution for the high majors and the way to drive continuity is just going to be further and further formalization of NIL and ways that can make that work to the point where it just doesn't really make sense to leave. Like, I think that's where the fix will come. It's not going to be, the NCAA actually turns around and wins all this legislation and is able to put in a hard and fast rule. It's going to be, okay, well, it just doesn't make sense to leave, whether it's multi-year contracts, whether it's some sort of profit sharing coming down at the high major leagues, where it's just like, okay, if you are this level at a high major, you don't really need to, like, there's going to be stuff that will change and I think make it better. But I do think everything points to low and mid majors just getting kind of more and more wiped out as we go. So I think that's the big concern. And then obviously, like, the 2-time transfer thing, I get that we're getting further and further away from actual college, but I don't know how you can possibly graduate when you're just switching schools every year and whatnot. And that adds all sorts of complications. So it's an interesting question. I do think that NIL is going to be what drives the solution, as far as, okay, we're going to figure out, these are going to be huge monetary agreements. I don't know how exactly it's going to work, but there's going to be a way to make it work that I think drives a little bit to at least put some of the control that people are looking for, right? So I don't know how that'll play out, but that's where I bet the solution would come from.
Yeah, it feels like the NIL has to be more tied to the school, right? Than, you mentioned the contract piece of it. Right now, it's kind of a wild west. We've got these collectives that, in a lot of cases, are being run by people that are used to work for the school or have a strong affiliation, but they're not actually like controlled by the university. But we all know kind of how it's working behind the scenes. Like, they're working in concert together. Like, it's kind of, I don't want to say a sham, but the schools are controlling in many ways a lot of the collectives. So I feel like it needs to be more of a formal agreement between the school and the player. Now, also with that comes, if you're talking about multi-year contracts, there's going to be a lot of things you got to think about, like in terms of players coming in, thinks they're a one and done, and all of a sudden, does the school want to say, we want to lock you up for 2 years? How all that works? There's going to have to be all that figured out. But I agree with you. There needs to be something more formal, set in stone, because you can't have situations where, and I'm not saying like this is the wrong thing to do, but like an example is like AJ Storr, right? He comes from St. John's to Wisconsin, has a really good season last year. And now he's, based on what you believe in terms of reporting, it seems like he's basically just going to go out on the market and get whatever deal he can get. And different schools are offering a lot more money. For Wisconsin, obviously, it's not a great deal for them because he came in, gave them one solid year, and now he's going to be gone, a big hole in their roster to fix. But I just don't think, for the health of the sport, having guys jump around multiple times like this is going to be a great solution.
Yeah, but also just let there be a choice, right? Like, let AJ Storr transfer from St. John's and he could sign a 2-year deal with Michigan State or a 1-year deal with Wisconsin or whatever. Like, there can be different rate. Like, I think
so at least everybody knows what's happening going in, right? It'd be a lot easier to know if we knew he was a 1-year deal at Wisconsin, right?
Yeah, and you can get a discount, right? Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with one and done freshmen, and everyone kind of knows the deal going in. Obviously, things can change, but just creating different options, I think, will help even it out, right? Like, if you have an option to go play 2 years somewhere for more money, or get the biggest deal right now for 1 year, if you're desperate for just a 1-year player, like, there's so much that can go into it. And I think we need to make sure that, like, someone like AJ Storr should be able to get as much money for his services as he wants. That might mean he's not going to go to a national championship like UConn, and that's just different options, right? Like, you're going to, like, I don't think we can really rule out any one thing. It's just right now it's complete wild, wild west. There's some collectives that are making like smart contracts that are fair for both sides. There are some that are completely one-sided. Who knows what you're actually getting paid? Like, it's just complete chaos. Mostly, I just think of how far we've come in NIL in like 2 years, from where it was like an idea to where some people were cheating, some people weren't. No one really knew. No one could stop it. Now it's like, okay, we're not going to stop anyone from cheating. You can do whatever you want. I feel like in 2 years, it'll be a lot more formalized, a lot more school involvement, a lot more kind of just tied into the whole ecosystem in a way that hopefully helps. So that's might be a pie in the sky look, but we'll see.
Yeah, the interesting thing is like where that's going to come from because we know the NCAA is kind of toothless in terms of its power to do anything. So is it going to come from legislation and the government? Is it going to come from these big conferences coming together and say, "Hey, we have to do something to change this"? That to me is the question that needs to be answered because I mean, the NCAA is always reactionary to everything. They're never proactive to figure anything out, and that's kind of where we're in the position that we're in. The other thing I just wonder in terms of the transfer portal and the health of the game in general is you kind of mentioned it there with a guy like AJ Store, and not to pick on him in any way, but guys that are chasing the deal like for the best deal and maybe not tied to winning. And I've talked to some people involved in the sport, and they've told me like the hardest thing when going into the portal and trying to find guys is like not only are you trying to get to know them and their people in a short amount of time, you're also trying to figure out like what's motivating them because you can go out. Let's say you have 5 or 6 million for NIL and you can go buy 4 or 5 players, but if all those players are just there for the NIL and they don't really care about helping your school win, what kind of team are you going to actually build? And so that's a big challenge, I think, for programs that are trying to build primarily out of the portal. I mean, this is a big thing, I think, for Indiana right now when they're trying to build a team out of the portal and they have a reportedly pretty robust NIL budget. It's one thing to go out there and build a team on paper, but how do those pieces actually fit together? And are the guys committed to actually winning games? I think is a huge challenge too.
Yeah, and that was a challenge in high school recruiting, but you got to figure out that kind of where kids stood on that sort of thing over months and years. And now it's okay, well, this guy entered the portal on April 2nd. We're going to have him in for an official visit on April 13th and push for a commitment on April 14th. Yep. You have to have, I think, a connection to people around. Like it comes down to really being able to scout these kids from people who know them, whether it's local and regional scouts, whether it's coaches who have coached them. Like, I think networking is really the biggest asset that kind of goes unnoticed. It's not just going to come down to a kid's KenPom stats or his efficiency or whatever, or his athletic ability. It's like, okay, is this guy actually going to want to be bought into what I'm teaching as a coach? What, like, is he going to help us win? And you can still get it wrong in that. So I don't know. And it's a tough situation. I think in his introductory press conference, Dusty May called it speed dating. And that's really what it is, right? Like, you're trying to cook up a whole roster of players that you are just really learning about. And you can have a scout looking at film of transfer guys all year, whatever, but it's a hard deal to pull off.
Yeah. You also have to, I think, have an army of people working the portal. It can't just be like 1 or 2 people that are, you better have, I think that's kind of where the advantage comes in for the bigger schools that have a team of people who are working on the portal. And I know this research starts months ago for a lot of these schools trying to like look at different players and maybe some of this transfer stuff becomes a little bit more manageable now that all the COVID year guys are going to be out of the system. So I think that's been another challenge the last couple of years that it's kind of made it even more difficult to track everything. I want to talk a little bit about last night's game, UConn and Purdue. Going in, obviously UConn was, a pretty solid favorite, but I think there was a lot of people who wondered, if Purdue shot the ball well from the perimeter, maybe get a great game from Zach Edey, can they pull the upset? They got a great game from Zach Edey, but UConn completely took away the 3-point shot, which I thought was a great kind of just a coaching game plan by Hurley. To he knew that Purdue was going to need to make some threes in order to beat them, and didn't allow that to happen. Anything surprised you just in general about last night's game and how it unfolded in terms of the result and how both teams played?
Yeah, I think the game plan has always been pretty simple, right? Everyone knows you have to take away the shooters, but only UConn had Donovan Clingan who could actually stop Zach Edey one-on-one, right? Like, right. It's not like it was a genius. It was the right game plan, but having Clingan is what made it possible, right? Like, having 6'6" guys across the perimeter who can just blanket Purdue's guards is what made it possible. I think that was really what stood out about that game, is that there's no one really out there other than Clingan who has had any success kind of guarding Edie one-on-one. And yeah, Edie scored 30 whatever points, but it wasn't on crazy efficiency. Most teams, if you let him take 25 shots, he's making 22 of them, right? Like, I think Klingon made it hard for him. He was physical. I think he played, he got away with contact early in a way that frustrated Edie. And then I think Edie was just kind of sped up and rushed from there. And I think that was really key. And then it was actually, they did well defensively, but they scored, I think, 1.23 points per possession, and they were just dominant on the offensive glass. And it was from every spot, right? They rebounded, I think, 43% of their missed shots. They were crashing. Purdue's gotten away with playing kind of this 3 small guard lineup, right? With Lance Jones kind of as the third guard. And I think UConn just had too much size on every spot other than the center spot where it was a draw. And that was, I think, what kind of undid Purdue. And again, take away the shots, get extra shots for yourself, and then you're in a good spot for UConn. And UConn just beat everyone by 15 plus points this year, whatever the heck it is.
Yeah, Klingon, I think you make a good point there. I was surprised at kind of what they let him get away with in terms of physicality early in the game. You know, you watch Big Ten games all season, and that happens in a Big Ten game at Mackey Arena or even on the road in the Big Ten. Whoever the opposing big man is, they're on the bench with 15 minutes with 2 fouls. And, but he was, he stood his ground. I thought he got away with some stuff, but once they kind of let it go, at that point, it's like, all right, Edie adjusted a little bit, made some tough shots. I mean, I thought where he made him catch the ball at times was a little bit further out than where he usually likes to get it. And you're right. I mean, having that presence in the paint allowed UConn to play him more straight up, which most teams can't do that because he's just going to go right. Who's going to do that? Who out
there can do that, right? I think it's just Klingon. Like, what big man in college basketball this year is able to just stand toe for toe and say, okay,
right? It's been that way for a while now. It's a couple of seasons. I mean, last year when they lost in the first round, it was they sent help and then the shooters didn't make shots, and that was and they turned the ball over. This year it was, UConn having that, top 10 NBA prospect, the guy that's really skilled. It's not like he's just a big body, but he can also just, alter shots and control the game. The other thing that just really impressed me watching UConn, obviously Indiana played them really early in the season, but watching them like throughout the tournament, a lot of teams were able to hang with them for a half and keep it a game. And like even last night going into halftime, it's like 6 points and you think, well, Purdue comes out and makes some threes in the second half and maybe it's a game. Purdue probably didn't feel terrible about where they are, but once the second half starts in a lot of these games, UConn just able to separate themselves by their depth and just the quality of players that they have at every position. They just wear you down, and with the speed and the intensity they play with, you could almost see a little confidence in Hurley, like going off the court for the halftime interview. They asked him just about how things were going, and he said, we kind of have them playing our pace, and I don't think they want to play this fast. And you could see Purdue, they just weren't as physical, and I don't want to say tough because it's not that Purdue's not a tough team. It's just the intensity with which UConn plays over a 40 minutes. There wasn't a team whole season that could match that. I mean, that's to me is the most impressive thing. It's not that they just had great players. It was like, man, when they came out, they played a full 40 minutes, and if you didn't bring it, you weren't beating them.
Yeah, and I think Hurley said after the game how they recruit pros that want to play for a team, and I think that shows, right? Like Castle plays in a way that isn't selfish, isn't like stat padding. He guards multiple spots. He makes the plays that are there. Like, I think they've had guys like that these last couple of years, and the ability to, I feel like that's a battle that's won in the recruiting process, right? Like getting the right kids in the door. And that can be really hit or miss with just kind of how NBA high school prospects are, right? Like the motivations aren't always the purest, I would say, for a lot of those kids. And it's not even a bad thing, but it's just they haven't learned how to play kind of winning college basketball in a short time. And to be able to find some of those guys, the blend has really worked for them. And then to be able to blend that with the portal, to have Klingon, I think like Klingon sort of felt like he had the injury and stuff a bit, so he didn't really have quite maybe the whole year. But I think going into this year, if he had been like, it seems like there's a path for him to have had like a Edie type dominant year if he were to just hang around in college. But I think he's probably headed off to the NBA, picked as like projected as a top 15 pick or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about we talk a lot about like recruiting rankings and amassing all this talent, but UConn just in general, their roster and Purdue too. I mean, it's not like it's a collection of McDonald's All-Americans and 5-star guys that everybody wanted. I mean, Caravan was a guy obviously that was heavily recruited, but plays his role perfectly. Newton, I think you mentioned to me earlier, he was a 5th-year guy, COVID extra year.
Yeah,
so
he last 2 years he came over from ECU. ECU
Yeah.
had all these guys who are like all high major players now in the portal and stuff.
I mean, Cam Spencer's another one who, we saw him at Rutgers last year, was a really good player, but I mean, how well did he play his role this year at UConn? Like he was playing around other great players and was kind of able to use like his skill set perfect fit for them. So, and not to take anything away from Purdue, I mean, I think they had an awesome season. By any measure, they were the best team all season in the Big Ten, one of the best teams in the country all season. I think when it comes down to it, though, when you look at just why they came up short, one is UConn was just an exceptional team, but also just Purdue in a couple of key spots. I didn't think Lawyer played particularly well. Braden Smith played much better last night than he did, I think, in the first Final Four game. And their guards, I just don't think were good enough to hang with UConn's.
Yeah, and just I don't know what guards were, right? Like UConn just has so much length there that I think that was the perfect matchup to sort of exploit where Purdue's guards would struggle a bit. And again, the thing that made Purdue go all year was you have to send 2 at Zach Edey. And once you don't have to send 2 at Zach Edey, everyone's superpower is gone a little bit there. And that's the story. So for me, that's the story. And I think like for the last year, everyone's take was Purdue losing in the first round is a sign that you can't win playing with bigs. Bigs don't win in college basketball. I kind of think that's BS because Purdue made it this far. Purdue proved everyone wrong in that sense. And Purdue didn't lose to a team that played some sort of scatter, trap, press, whatever kind of system they lost to last year. They lost to a team that had a big who was able to stand up to their big. So I think the fact that 2 of the teams that were the last 2 standing played through their bigs is a sign that there's not just one way that you can win in college basketball. It's not just, you need guards that can do this, that, and the rest. And like I give Purdue credit for, I think, proving a lot of people wrong because they've been one of the 3 best teams in the sport for the last 2 years and basically took the entire summer eating it from everyone, just talking that they're not going to.
I mean, they ate it all the way till the tournament, right? I mean,
and
really
they went and won 5 games. So I think they deserve a lot of credit for that.
I know it's a little early for this, but what's Purdue look like in a post Edey world? Like looking at the pieces that they have. I mean, how big of a drop off do you think we're looking at in terms of? Obviously, he's the 2-time reigning National Player of the Year. You're not replacing that, but I just wonder with the pieces that they have, what that's going to look like moving forward.
Yeah, it's fascinating because they have a huge class coming in. They have a lot of kind of underclassmen who've been highly touted, but haven't really gotten a big opportunity. I think Braden Smith, you look at him as probably the best point guard in the Big Ten next year. So you have a really good building block, but is it like Trey Kaufman-Renn is the guy you play through and he's like your second scorer? Maybe. And I know he played really well on their international tour with like where Edey wasn't there. So I can see the pieces, but to me, it feels like maybe a team where you're figuring out a bit this year. And then you have a team that's a pure contender, Braden Smith's senior year, when a lot of these young guys have a year. Because there's going to be a lot of guys, I think, breaking into new roles, right, that just haven't played major minutes. And I think some of those guys like Colvin and Heidi, like they were out there last night, but they didn't look like ready to be out there last night. And I think now that you're going to look to them to go through the grind of a whole Big Ten season and be sort of everyday contributors, I think they'll get there. But I think it's going to be more of like Purdue's a top 25 team that's getting better and better at the end of the year. And then you're like, wow, look at everything this team comes back. Braden Smith as a senior, all this wing talent. And then probably by then, one of the 7'3" guys on the roster is good. And you're like, oh my goodness, they're back again the next year. So I think it's going to be one of those slow build years. But the talent and the recruiting seems to be there.
Yeah, for sure. want to switch gears here and talk obviously about Michigan. We haven't talked since the season ended. Obviously, the change was made with Juwan Howard exiting after what was a really promising start to his tenure, and then things just kind of went off a cliff, and for a variety of reasons, which I don't think we're gonna dive too deep into because that's all said and done. But obviously, Michigan goes out and makes a great. Well, I don't want to call it a great hire because there's been a lot of great hires that have been made over the year, including Archie Miller at Indiana and countless other, hires over the years that people thought looked great on paper. But in terms of a resume and a guy who seems like he's going to be a good fit at Michigan and has had a ton of success the last couple of years at Florida Atlantic, Dusty May comes in to Michigan. Obviously, the Indiana ties. Indiana fans are aware of him based on his spending time at IU as a manager from Indiana. What was just kind of their reaction from the Michigan fan base with the hire of Dusty May, and it was kind of a process that took a little bit of time to unfold with Michigan. Did you get the sense that he was like their top target, the guy they really wanted from the beginning, or how did it all play out?
Yeah, so I think the sense was Michigan would obviously like put out feelers to, I guess, the guys you try to poach away from big schools, right? Like you do that in any search. But I think it quickly became clear that Dusty May was the top guy on the list as far as the realistic candidate pool. I think that became clear for a lot of schools, right? Louisville and Vanderbilt also were very interested in Dusty May. And I think from Michigan's point of view, it seems like kind of the no-brainer home run hire, right? Like, I don't think it's a guaranteed success, but he checks all the right boxes, says the right things. I think the success he's had with building a program at FAU, a place that has basically no resources to speak of before he got there, is telling. I think the Final Four run is, I think Michigan fans that read my site or whatnot will point to that as something that can be fluky, right? Like you shouldn't base someone on a Final Four run, but it's nice to have. And he's won 60 games over the past 2 years at a place that doesn't win 30 games in a season, right? So
I mean,
I think
no one was talking about Florida Atlantic before Dusty May, right? I mean,
ever.
I would have not even known what conference they were in if you would have just brought them up to me 2.5 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. And he built that out of nothing. I think that he fits. I think the type of program he wants to build is in line with what can work at Michigan. I think he wants to build sort of this sustainable NIL. He wants to be based on high school recruiting, which I think because of Michigan's kind of transfer and academic issues that they've obviously been well publicized at this point, and the end of the COVID year, which is going to lead to even fewer kind of high level transfers that Michigan can recruit. I think that has to be the approach. And like you can argue about whether high school recruiting is the way to go in this day and age, but I think it makes sense for Michigan. And I think he fits that. He was able to kind of build this FAU team in a similar way. He was able to keep them after a Final Four run with his NIL, all that. So I think it's a lot of excitement. I think a lot of Michigan fans very excited for a fresh start. But again, like right now, Michigan has basically an empty roster. You can kind of build your own adventure and see what you want to see, right? Like you can go and say, oh, well, all these transfers listing Michigan are obviously going to come to Michigan and they'll be great. For now, it's kind of up in the air.
Yeah. So what is the lay of the land right now in terms of just what Michigan actually has committed for next season? Has anyone said they're coming back that was on last season's team, and what is the task ahead? Obviously, there's been speculation that some of these Florida Atlantic players will likely head to Michigan. You mentioned the transfer issues. Do you anticipate that there's going to be any issues in terms of getting guys in? How's that all going to kind of transpire?
So right now, Michigan has essentially 4 guys on scholarship. Jace Howard, Will Cheddar, Namari Burnett, and Darrell Brooks, who's an incoming freshman. So
Okay.
9 spots to play with. You would presume using 9 spots to probably recruit a starting lineup. Obviously, Namari Burnett started last year. I think probably better served as more of a 6th-man type. So blank slate for Dusty May to work with. It's hard to even say how things fit, right? Like if you're getting you have to fill in some of the spots on the board before you even know what fits with the rest. I think they've cast a pretty wide net right now. Obviously, kind of the FAU big three have drawn a lot of attention. John L. Davis is basically the top player in the portal right now. He'll obviously have options from all over, but Michigan has a strong connection there. Michigan hired the assistant coach from Georgia who actually recruited him to FAU. So that's another kind of helper there. Vlad Golden, the 7-footer in the middle, he is probably the most likely to come at this point. And then Elijah Martin is kind of the other star, kind of an up and down year, was banged up a little bit early and then never quite had a great year. So it's those three are kind of the crown jewels of that class, but you're going to need a lot more. And I think what's going to be most interesting from a Michigan point of view is what sort of transfers fill those holes. Is it mostly grad transfers that you're going to have to replace the next year? Is it more freshmen, sophomores, guys that have multiple years of eligibility? Because I think you need to get this roster back on track a little bit where you're returning something instead of building a new team every year.
You mentioned just those three guys. Is it pretty much clear that those are really the only viable pieces from Florida Atlantic, or could there be other guys that would be looked at? Like, I know they've hired a new coach. I think it was an assistant coach from Baylor down at Florida Atlantic. Is there obviously they were more than just those three players. They had a good team. Was it some of those guys graduate, or are there other guys that could possibly be additions?
So there are two other kind of rotation guys in the portal. One is Nick Boyd, who was kind of their starting point guard, sometimes sixth man, other times. He didn't list Michigan in his list of contacts. So I'm not sure if that's a Michigan thing or a Boyd thing or what, but he seems to be looking for something else. And then they had kind of a backup big man who was not really, I wouldn't say Big Ten caliber. He's already committed to Charlotte. So he's probably he was kind of this 8-minute a game guy who would play a different style offensively, but is probably looking to get more minutes somewhere like Charlotte than transfer up a level. So those are kind of the other two. I don't think there's really anything else on the roster that would transfer up to the high major level, but like the John L. Davis thing is really the ultimate lottery, right? Like he's a guy who, if he comes into Michigan, he could be an all Big Ten type of guard, right? He's that level of player. He was the American Player of the Year last year, co-player of the year. So I think that's the one that you look at as, okay, if you get him on the roster, you have a way to kind of put the pieces together and build a team that can be a contender. Whereas if you don't get him, maybe you kind of try to focus on a bunch of young pieces and build up something for the future. So Dusty May was pretty clear in his press conference that he wants to win year one. He was asked like if he was going to plan on building slowly, and he said it's important to put a good product on the floor from day one. So he's not setting the bar low for his first offseason, that's for sure. Yeah,
John L. Davis is from Gary, Indiana, right? Too. So that from a geography standpoint, I think that probably helps too in terms of being somewhat close to where he's from, and I would think there'd be some loyalty there with what Dusty May did for him from a developmental standpoint down at Florida Atlantic and the success they've had together. What sense have you gotten from like an NIL standpoint? I know like before with Michigan, that may have been a challenge under Juwan Howard. And I think that's obviously an important lifeblood for any program. Has Michigan kind of committed? Well, obviously Michigan can't commit to anything, but in terms of like the collectives, does there seem to be better organization moving forward? And do you think the resources are going to be kind of pumped up in a meaningful way to where it's not going to be as much of an obstacle as it was before?
Yeah, so there's a couple layers to that in the sense that the first big hurdle is sort of the NCAA rule changes with NIL that allow more university involvement with collectives and things like that. Michigan was, I think, probably one of the schools that was most likely to act to the letter of what was the NIL laws of the sport. And now that the NCAA said they're not prosecuting any of those and is just given up on enforcing any of those rules, Michigan has moved to make some sort of internal hires as far as like a athletic department wide NIL GM, things of that nature to sort of facilitate the relationship between the university, the collectives, things that should have been done a long time ago, but basically weren't done for appearances of following the rules. So that was going to happen regardless. Those were all kind of in place before the season ended. And I think there's been a lot of improvements as far as just collective organization for basketball, for football, for everything across the AD. The other thing is that Dusty May has been pretty clear that he plans to be aggressive and spend a lot of time raising NIL money. He said he spent 25 to 30% of his time at FAU raising money for NIL. And I'm going to go ahead and venture a guess that's more time than Juwan Howard spent when he was at Michigan. I think that alone, like, there is obviously a lot of money out there from Michigan alumni. Raising money shouldn't really be an issue. So I think you would look to think that there's already improvements in place and that Dusty May's kind of plan will focus on continuing to improve those. So I think the situation is improved to the extent that you would think, and it should continue to improve based on how the pieces are set up right now.
Yeah, Michigan's got one of the stronger alumni networks of anybody in the Big Ten. I mean, I know you've gone and like spoke at an alumni thing before to some Michigan fans, and they have, alumni groups all over the country. And Indiana's a similar thing where they've got a strong alumni base all across the country. So it was always kind of perplexing to me, like when we talked about Michigan's NIL, that it wasn't maybe at the same level. But to me, if things are going well and going in the right direction, it seems like there's no reason they shouldn't be able to have one of the top NIL budgets in the Big Ten. Obviously, football maybe takes away a little bit from that, but also you don't need as much money for basketball.
Yeah, I think football having this run of winning the national championship and sort of a push in football to embrace NIL will actually help, just as far as opening those doors and the idea of kind of chipping into that. I think just the whole viewpoint from the university, from the athletic department, from donors is shifting on NIL in a way that it used to be kind of frowned upon, and I would say less so now in a positive way.
Just a big picture question for you on the portal, because I know you track a lot of this stuff as closely as anybody, and we're talking about it every day. But when do you think some of these dominoes in the portal are going to start falling? And we're in this dead period now that ends Thursday. It feels like the next couple of weekends could probably get pretty busy in terms of visits and commitments starting to happen. Is that kind of how you think about it too? I'm getting like questions from Indiana fans a lot, like, it's April 9th. Should we be worried? No one's committed from the portal. And I'm like, well, we're about halfway in terms of the window to enter. That's not like the deadline. Guys can obviously commit after that date. But I feel like now that the Final Four is over and this dead period ends April 11th, and then there's another dead period in May, I think a lot of stuff's going to happen here in the next couple of weeks, it feels like.
Yeah, I think I saw a stat that something like only like 150 out of 1,200 people in the portal or something have committed already. So basically, I think a lot of it is waiting, like, because if you think about it, this is when everyone wants the portal to open, right? Like, all the media is pushing for open the portal after the Final Four, not after the Selection Sunday. I think this dead period is going to open the floodgates, right? I think you'll have a bunch of guys taking their first visit this weekend. A lot of those guys will commit. A lot of those guys will cut their lists. A lot, like, I think. And then as that goes, you'll see kind of the last wave of players be pushed to the portal, right? Because there's going to be the second wave of, okay, well, my coach just signed a guy who plays my position from the portal. Now I'm going to enter the portal. Like that's always the second wave of portal entries that you get at the end of the month. So I think you're looking at really these next 10 to 15 days. I think you'll see hundreds of guys coming off the board across the country. And then that'll obviously have a trickle down effect to almost every program. I think this dead period has definitely come in a way where it's not just a dead period, but coaches are all out schmoozing at the Final Four. Like, I think there's probably even less non-dead period restricted recruiting, right? Like, everyone's just kind of on pause for the Final Four, but now that it's over, I think it's going to be full steam ahead.
Last thing, you kind of talked about the window for the portal when it opens. What ideally do you think needs? I think we can both agree as two people that are now trying to follow this stuff and cover two schools with a ton of openings in the portal. It's difficult to stay on top of it. For the schools, if you're playing in the tournament, it has to be a heavy lift too, trying to worry about the portal and the tournament. one, do you understand why the portal opens when it does? I mean, what would be the drawback to pushing it back a little bit? Is it they're just trying to give more time based on like the academic calendar? And ideally, like what would you like to see done in terms of this window? I mean, I think if it was opening today and you still gave 45 days, it seems a little bit like that could work. But then you also have like now they've pushed the April live period into May, and like are we all of a sudden going to start? Coaches don't want to. I think the other part of it is like coaches don't want to keep like working all the way through like June. They actually want some time in June to like enjoy their life a little bit and also start to work. Their teams are starting to come on campus. Like there's got to be something's got to be figured out. Like in terms of the timelines, I just don't know what the answer is.
Yeah, and the whole thing is what 275 teams, something like that. Their seasons are over 3 weeks ago,
Right.
so they're gonna decide who's going in the portal but not go in. Like there is a reason to have people be able to enter the portal over the last 3 weeks. Like it feels like ages ago that Michigan's season ended. Right? Like the Big Ten tournament feels like a different lifetime ago, at least for me. So I think that it doesn't really make a ton of sense to restrict it to Selection Sunday. Do we really feel bad that UConn had to focus on the Final Four instead of recruiting the portal? Like they'll probably be fine. They're just going to make some phone calls this week and be right in the middle of probably the three best guys in the portal because they're going to say, "Look what we just did." So
Right.
we don't stop recruiting in any other time of year, right? Like you're allowed to go to the state playoffs or whatever else during the season, and we don't act like it's a disaster for these poor coaches. Like I think it just seems like something that coaches want to complain about more than anything. And I assume whatever you change it to, they'll complain again. So I just feel like there's always something in the national media that coaches want to complain about. And right now it's the portal being open too long. I don't know. Just let them
I think the one thing
days,
I didn't
whatever.
like about it, one thing I don't like about it is like that first week that it opens is also like when the bracket has just come out, and it feels like the discussion should be more centered around the bracket and the first games of the tournament. And it's like, and maybe that's just because I'm like in the thick of it, like trying to cover the portal stuff, and maybe that's not like how most people are actually thinking. Maybe most people are thinking about the tournament and that, but it feels like it took some of the attention away from like the opening week of the tournament when you have guys like entering the portal like the same day as games are going on.
Maybe April, just make it the whole month of April. I feel like that would be a solution, right? Because most people are done by then. You have a month. I think the big risk for me when you start shrinking the portal window is guys getting recruited over, though. Like the whole thing with between like if you get recruited over and then you can't go in the portal, that's what I worry about. So the window has to be decently long so that the guys who are coming in from the portal give you a chance to leave. But
That's another reason why some commitments are probably going to start happening sooner rather than later, is because for that second wave to happen, some schools have to start taking some players. Like they have till May 1st, and I don't think that's going to be extended or anything. I did say last thing on that. I did want to ask you one more thing. The Kentucky job. What, like, it's not often, I'm living down here in Louisville, but I like to call this, one of the best areas in the country for college basketball because we got the, Louisville here, Indiana, Kentucky, kind of a triangle here of programs with passionate fan bases. Not often that you see two jobs in this area open the same year. Obviously, Louisville goes out and gets Pat Kelsey, and now Kentucky with this bombshell, which again, this happened Sunday, this all happened. It's like, all right, on the eve of the national championship, we're not talking so much about the game. We're talking about the Kentucky job opening. And I saw yesterday, there was a funny video, like John Calipari, like walking his dog down the street and like somebody's like chasing him, not chasing him, but like asking for a comment. He still got his Kentucky blue on, and Trilly Donovan's trying to give updates all day on what's actually going on. It seems like it's actually going to happen. He's going to go to Arkansas, to me, which is just a couple of weeks ago. He sits down for an interview with Mitch Barnhart, and they're singing Kumbaya. Everything's great. But I just had a feeling like after what happened with Oakland, I was like, I don't think he can come back. Like the fan base, which I know some Kentucky fans, they were like completely done with the guy. But like, what do you make of this whole situation? And like to me, like there's a risk here for Kentucky that they actually end up worse off, because say what you want about Calipari, he at least had them in the mix every season, year in and year out, from a talent standpoint.
Yeah, and I mean, my argument against it would be with the end of the COVID year, coming up, his strategy is going to become more viable again in a way that I think there's clearly a dip in their results that was completely tied to all of a sudden you have 24-year-olds making up the thick of all these rosters. And in 3 years from now, maybe recruiting high school and being able to recruit the high school ranks at that level becomes a lot more valuable again. That would be what you're hoping to buy if you're Arkansas and you're making that higher. And I think it's definitely possible. I also think he'll be able to recruit pretty damn well at Arkansas with their resources they're put behind him just because of who he is. I think there's at least a little bit of question there, but I think it could work. I also think maybe that there will be just more seismic shifts in the sport that there's a lot more modern offenses and defenses and things of that nature in the sport that I don't know that he's necessarily kept up with. And there's this kind of young wave of coaches who aren't really afraid to displace the older coaches who are doing things a different way. Maybe that is a ticking time bomb and on the way out. I think that's kind of the case for and against Cal. As far as who Kentucky hires, you don't know when people start saying no where you're going to end up. And that's the risk. I think you should be able to get a home run hire. Like if you're getting Drew and okay, that's a good hire. I think he'd do really well there. I don't know. You're not going to get Nate Oates, apparently. I think that would be one that would fit, but I don't see it. I guess he said no, or sometimes you don't know if.
I mean, he had to say that. I think from a recruiting, if you're going to recruit the
not.
portal right now, right, you got to say that. You can't let this play out. I mean, but they're throwing Jay Wright, I think, said no. Or at least said he wasn't interested. Hurley, obviously, what's he going to say after the game ends last night? But
Hurley's going to get a big raise either way.
If they offer him 10 or 12 million, does the conversation change? I mean, who knows? I mean, they're off the hook now for paying Calipari the whatever ridiculous 32, 33 million that they owed him. So I think it's going to be fascinating to watch it play out. I'm just, say what you want about Calipari. Year in and year out, he had a top 2 or 3 recruiting class. Look at the NBA, and it's littered with players that played for him. And I mean, that's obviously the argument for Kentucky fans is all right, he had all these players and didn't win, but it's also very hard to win national championships. He had a really good run, obviously fell off the last 4 or 5 years. It'll be interesting just to kind of see how it all shakes out. From an IU perspective, I was actually holding out hope that he would at least coach a couple of the games in the IU Kentucky series, but it doesn't look like that's going to be the case.
Maybe that's why he left.
Well, we knew he wasn't coming to Assembly Hall after 2011. That's why they put the game last in the series, and only agreed to come to Bloomington once and 2 games in Rep Arena, which I still don't understand why IU agreed to that, but it is what it is. Dylan, always good to talk to you. You need to get back in the portal and see what's going on with Michigan
over here.
Yeah, who knows? Something could have happened while we were recording this. So thanks, Dylan. Always good talking to you.
Always good to be on. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everybody, as always, for listening to Podcast on the Brink. Last week, we took the week off. Wasn't a ton going on from a news perspective, but I think that's going to change here the next couple weeks, hopefully with the transfer portal picking up, and Indiana's got to get to work. They got 6 spots to fill, and better start filling them sooner rather than later. If you enjoy the show, as always, leave us a rating or review over on Apple Podcasts. Leave us a rating on Spotify, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.